Over 4,000 years ago, a man of obscure birth rose to reshape the known world. He is known to us as Sargon of Akkad, and he is traditionally hailed as history's first great conqueror. The story is a compelling blend of documented history and a sprinkling of legend. The old stories recount how he emerged from his humble origins, even a claim that he was set adrift as an infant in a basket on a river, but managed to conquer all of Mesopotamia, forging a new model of a multi-city empire. What we're going to talk about today is how a mere cup-bearer such as him ascended to become this king of Kish, and then a master of an empire, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. It is a tale that has the grandeur of myth, yet it unfolds against a backdrop of very real historical change at the dawn of civilization. It begins around the 24th century BCE, when Mesopotamia was a patchwork of city-states, Uruk, Ur, and Kish among others. And these states did not quite get along. They often fought each other. No single king had ever ruled them all by force, until Sargon. In fact, his reign initiated what became known as the Sargonic period, a new era where Semitic Akkadian language and culture spread alongside the older Sumerian traditions. His achievements were so extraordinary that for centuries after, Mesopotamians idolized him as a semi-divine figure, a measure of greatness for all those to come. But we will see that his reign was not without challenges. Certainly not. Revolts simmered, and maintaining control over a vast territory, well, that was as arduous a task as winning it in the first place. And so our story is pieced together from these ancient chronicles, king lists, inscriptions, and later legends. Many of them mix glorification with historical fact. It's just what comes with the time. But today, we're going to give precedence to the earliest sources, those clay tablets and inscriptions that are nearest to Sargon's own time, reconstructing the most reliable narrative. But we won't forget about those intriguing little anecdotes from later legends, of course not without scrutinizing their credibility. The aim is to get a proper portrait of Sargon, as both a man of his time and also a larger-than-life figure of world history. And so before we begin, consider this. Sargon's very name in Akkadian, Saru-Ukin, actually means legitimate or true king. Now that hints that he might have taken a regal name to assert his right to rule, perhaps masking an unusual path to power. Indeed, unlike princes born on the throne, silver spoon in their mouth, Sargon's early years were spent far from any palace. According to tradition, he was a gardener's son, who had to earn his kingship by his own wit and his own strength. So, let's talk all about Sargon of Akkad, his origins first, and see how the stage was set for the rise of a true legend. But of course, let me welcome you to the channel first. I hope that the introduction was sufficient to perk your ears up and give you a little introduction of what kind of character we're talking about here. Well, let me invite those who have not subscribed yet to hit that button and leave your comments down below. Always good for the algorithm. And here's some good news. As usual, this video, like all of the other videos on this channel, is 100% ad-free. Well, that's pretty good, isn't it? Of course. Well, this is made possible because of the kind donations of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and the YouTube donations, PayPal donations, those who checked out the merch store, all these kinds of things. If you want to just enjoy the video, then great. But if you want to check out any of those avenues, there's a link to them in the description and the pinned comments. But for now, let's just get nice and comfortable, shall we? And we may begin. So, the circumstances of Sargon's birth and childhood. We can't quite bring down a historical consensus upon them. It's wrapped up in quite a bit of mythology. Maybe we'll dig something up from the ground in some cuneiform tablet later on, but for now, we have to kind of take what we know with a grain of salt. Either way, this mythological beginning offers a valuable insight into how later Mesopotamians viewed their great leader. Quite a bit of pride, of course. According to an Akkadian text known as, quote, the Legend of Sargon, the future king introduces himself with a rather dramatic tale. He claims that he did not know his father, and that his mother was a rather secretive figure, described as a changeling or temple priestess who could not keep her child. In this legend, the poor infant Sargon was placed in a basket of rushes sealed with bitumen and set afloat on the waters of the Euphrates River. Now do remember, Mesopotamia does mean the land between the two rivers, one being the Euphrates River, the other being the Tigris River. Well, back to it. By fate, the basket was found by a man named Aki. He was a gardener, drawing water from the river, when by chance he just saw it floating by. Now this image of the infant hero cast adrift, only to be saved and adopted, it might sound pretty familiar. It of course closely parallels the much later biblical story of Moses. Of course, all of these old stories certainly come from somewhere. Flood stories, these stories of these humble beginnings of kings, all that. They all have very deep roots beyond what we immediately can recognize them with in our basic Western theological sense. But in fact, most scholars believe now that the Sargon birth legend is the earliest known example of this floating in a basket down a river motif, predating Moses by many, many centuries. But what does this legend actually tell us? It has to mean something, right? Well, on one level, it was kind of a royal propaganda apparatus, presenting Sargon as this man of great destiny, chosen by the gods from birth, despite humble origins. The involvement of the river and the act of being saved from death gives Sargon's rise this kind of providential aura. Now notably, the goddess Inanna, also known as Ishtar in some rendering, plays a role in his early life in these stories. She's often said to have guided and personally protected Sargon. In later accounts, Sargon explicitly credits Inanna with his survival and success. The subtext is pretty clear. Sargon's power was sanctioned by the divine, and his unlikely path to kingship, well, it was all just part of the great cosmic plan. All rather convenient, don't you think? We've heard these stories before. We can't disprove them, but it's certainly hard to go the other way. But let's talk about, in terms of historically speaking, Sargon was very likely of common birth, perhaps hailing from a region of northern Sumer or Akkad, that is central Mesopotamia. And his original name is unknown too. Sargon was probably a throne name he adopted once he seized power. Of course, we can take a look at this through the Sumerian king list, quite an important source, a valuable chronological record compiled a few centuries after his time, mind you, but it does confirm some key details of Sargon's background. It describes Sargon as the, quote, son of a gardener, and notes that he served as a cup-bearer to Ur-Zababa, the king of Kish. Being a gardener's son, well, that implies Sargon had no noble lineage to claim. He emerged right from those proletariat, working, laboring class. Yet in Mesopotamian society, talented individuals could rise through palace service. The position of cup-bearer, known in the Sumerian tongue as Shakati, was no mere servant's job either. It was a high-ranking official role, quite akin to a royal confidant or vizier. Well, ancient cup-bearers were second only to the king in importance. They not only served wine, but also advised the king and managed palace affairs. Thus, the young Sargon must have shown exceptional capability to attain this post under King Ur-Zababa himself. Well, according to a later Sumerian narrative known as the Sargon and Ur-Zababa piece, Sargon's rise at Kish came with quite a few omens and a sprinkling of danger. Because what's a good story without them, Well, in this tale, this Sargon and Ur-Zababa tale, the gods decide to end the reign of Ur-Zababa, and ominous dreams begin to trouble the king. One night, Ur-Zababa dreams that the goddess Inanna drowns him in a river of blood. Not the kind of dream that you want to have, I suppose. A pretty terrifying vision by anyone's standard. And he suspects that it's related to his new cup-bearer, Sargon. Now, we could perhaps stretch the definition. Remember, we talked about bearing wine and all the rest. Perhaps the wine is symbolic. Perhaps the next day when he goes and sees Sargon bringing this red liquid, it immediately brings back those bad memories of the nightmares. In any case, upon hearing that Sargon too had a disturbing dream in which Ur-Zababa was submerged in blood by a giant young woman, clearly Inanna or Ishtar in symbolic form, the king grew fearful that this upstart might actually usurp him. And this is where the trouble starts. Ur-Zababa's fear turned to full-blown paranoia, and the full-blown paranoia turned to plotting to murder Sargon. The legend describes how Ur-Zababa attempted to eliminate Sargon not once, but twice. The first time, he ordered Sargon to deliver a sealed message to the royal metalsmith, not knowing the letter contained instructions to kill whoever bore it. But the loyal smith nearly carried out the deed by luring Sargon to the foundry, planning to cast him into molten metal. But it was here that Inanna came down and intervened. The story says that the goddess made sure Sargon did not enter the trap, warning that the foundry was a holy place, unfit for bloodshed. Well, that was the first attempt, well and truly thwarted, by a goddess, no less. So Ur-Zababa next sent Sargon on a mission to the king of Uruk, carrying a clay tablet that secretly requested Sargon's execution. This plan also failed, though. The king of Uruk at the time was Lugal-Zaghazi, and instead of killing Sargon, Lugal-Zaghazi actually treated him with quite a bit of respect. Perhaps he was doubting Ur-Zababa's intentions. It's hard to know the exact reason. But either way, things were pretty good for Sargon upon arrival. There are some versions that even insinuate that Lugal-Zaghazi's own wife took Sargon's side, sheltering him from harm. Ur-Zababa himself ultimately met a grim fate off-stage in the saga. He disappears from the accounts, presumably overthrown or killed amid the chaos that he feared. They're pretty dramatic episodes, don't you think? And we kind of have to dip our toes outside the realm of history for it, but, like I said, the further you go back, ancient Greece, a little bit of Rome, China, India, and Mesopotamia, Egypt, all these kinds of things, we have to blend this culture of mythology going into history together. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't let anyone tell you you can't talk about certain things because it hasn't been completely peer-reviewed. It's all right to engage in introspection. If not, just for our own pure enjoyment. Anyway, all of these later literature, of course, they look back upon the events of Sargon. They likely contain kernels of truth about Sargon's environment. You see, Kish, that was a significant city in Sumer, often holding the title King of Kish as a mark of hegemony over northern Mesopotamia. If Sargon was an ambitious cupbearer, it stands to reason that he might have capitalized on any opportunity to take power, especially if his king was weak or perhaps incapacitated by fear. Uzababa's historical end isn't clearly recorded, but it does appear that Sargon did succeed him as the ruler of Kish. Whether Sargon rebelled or overthrew his master, or just stepped into a power vacuum after Uzababa's fall, it doesn't matter. The result is all the same. He emerged as the king of Kish around the year 2334 BCE, in what is known as the Mesopotamian Middle Chronology. The king list states, quote, Sargon became king, the king of Akkad, who built Akkad. Now this indicates that kingship passed from Kish to Sargon's own city, Akkad. That's why he's not called Sargon of Kish, but rather Sargon of Akkad. Makes sense, doesn't it? But there are two important things that happen at this juncture that we need to mention before we move on to our next section, and they really set Sargon apart. First, he founded, or at least vastly expanded, a new capital city, that being Akkad or Akkad, rather than ruling from Kish. It was this kind of act that symbolized a fresh start, a new dynasty, unbound by the old Sumerian city loyalties. Akkad's precise location is lost to history. Archaeologists have yet to identify its ruins, and I say yet. Fingers crossed we will one day, just like how we found Troy. People thought we'd never find that, but we bloody well found it, though, didn't we? But what we do know is that the location was likely on the Euphrates, in the central Mesopotamian plain. A pretty big search area, but it's better than nothing. So by establishing Akkad as his seat, Sargon signaled that his kingship was not merely inheriting Kish's realm, but actually transforming it into something new. So that's the first point. The second is that he almost immediately faced resistance from the rest of Sumer, the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, which had recently been unified under Lugal-Zaghazi of Uruk, were not too keen on the idea of bowing to a newcomer from Kish/Akkad, at least not without a good fight. Sargon's ascension thus sets this stage for this momentous clash of the ancient world with Lugal-Zaghazi, along with the Sumerian elites, and that would really mark the true beginning of his empire building. Because what's the building of an empire without a few bouts of bloodshed? Well, let's do it. When Sargon seized power in Kish, he effectively inherited a state of war. Not the best circumstances to walk into, but, well, it's just the way it is. The Sumerian king Lugal-Zaghazi of Uruk had, shortly before Sargon's rise, conquered a swath of Mesopotamia, and he did so with uniting many Sumerian city-states under his new dominion. Lugal-Zaghazi boasted of controlling the lands from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a claim to wide-ranging rule that soon Sargon would contest. But initially, Sargon and Lugal-Zaghazi might have seen a common enemy in Ur-Zababa, but any fleeting alliance or cordiality between them simply did not last. As per the stories, once Ur-Zababa was out of the picture, Sargon and Lugal-Zaghazi became rivals. Sargon moved aggressively to challenge Uruk's supremacy. The confrontation unfolded in a few phases, the first one being Sargon marching south into the heart of Sumer. His target was Uruk, the power base of Lugal-Zaghazi. According to Sargon's later inscriptions, preserved in copies from long after his reign, he won a decisive battle in Uruk, in which he, quote, tore down the walls of Uruk and captured Lugal-Zaghazi himself. Off to a pretty good start, isn't he? There is one particularly vivid account that says Sargon put Lugal-Zaghazi in a wooden yoke or neck stock, just like a common prisoner, a king reduced to a peasant, basically. The conquered king was then brought in a collar to Nippur, the holy city of Enlil, Sumer's chief deity. And this gesture was highly symbolic. By dragging Lugal-Zaghazi to the temple of Enlil in Nippur, Sargon demonstrated that even the greatest Sumerian king was now subjugated, and that Enlil, that god who granted kingship, had clearly chosen Sargon as the new man in charge. And how could you argue with the will of the gods? Ancient Mesopotamians might have understood this scene as the transfer of divine favor. You see, Nippur was kind of a neutral, sacred ground, and triumphing there, well, that was a statement of legitimacy like no other. Sargon's own titles at this point reflect to his new stature. In that Nippur inscription he calls himself, quote, Sargon, king of Akkad, king of Kish, anointed of Anu, overseer of Ananna, governor of Enlil, king of the land. Bit of a long title, I suppose. Now, just before we do move on, you will hear this word Ensi sometimes. That is governor. Okay, so when we say Ensi, we basically just mean governor. So in one breath, he links himself to multiple religious and political traditions. You might have heard the word Anu. Well, that was the sky god of his northern city, perhaps implying patronage from Akkad's deity. Inanna was his personal patroness who guided him, and Enlil was the supreme god who decreed kingship. And then by taking the ancient Sumerian title Ensi of Enlil, so governor of Enlil, Sargon presented himself as Enlil's chosen administrator on earth. By styling himself as king of Kish, even after founding Akkad, he kept the traditional prestige of the Kish title, which in Mesopotamian ideology conferred authority over all of Sumer. Essentially, Sargon was consolidating Sumer under this new order. So, with Uruk fallen and Lugal-Zaghazi well and truly humiliated, Sargon proceeded to secure the upper key Sumerian cities. He reportedly defeated Ur, Lagash, Umma, and others, bringing the entire southern plain under his control. Some of these conquests might not have been straightforward battles. In some cases, local rulers might have just submitted to him once Uruk was well and truly down. Didn't want to fight a losing battle, I suppose it makes sense. But there is evidence that the conquest of Sumer was, in general, quite hard fought. We have an ancient text that credits Sargon with triumphing in 30 4 battles in the course of his campaigns. This suggests that numerous city armies and coalitions attempted to resist him. They didn't do very well, though, apparently. Rest in pieces to them. Of course, Sargon's forces ultimately prevailed, and yes, he did destroy the walls of many cities, another strategic measure to prevent further rebellion. Now, destroying city walls was actually a classic policy in Mesopotamia when subjugating foes. It physically disarmed the cities by removing their primary defenses. The victory over Sumer was not just a political and military turning point, but it was a turning point in civilization itself. You see, for the first time in recorded history, the many city-states of Mesopotamia were united under a single monarch, with a centralized authority at that. Sargon effectively ended this era of independent Sumerian city kings and inaugurated a new era, often called the Akkadian Empire. As a mark of this, Sargon and his immediate successors are sometimes referred to as the, quote, Sargonic dynasty, as we've mentioned. The Sumerian king list acknowledges this shift by listing Sargon as the first king of the dynasty of Akkad, and it assigns him a reign of 56 years, a span which may be exaggerated, perhaps even symbolic. But in any case, it indicates a very long and stable rule. But it's worth noting, before we do move on, that Sargon's conquests did not kill off the Sumerian culture, but they rather created a fusion. Sargon himself, likely a Semitic Akkadian speaker, adopted that title of Ensi, which was a Sumerian term, not Akkadian, and honored the Sumerian gods. He appointed governors, often Akkadian officials or local loyal rulers, to oversee the Sumerian cities. One of Sargon's most notable appointments was in the spiritual domain. He installed his daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of Nana, the moon god, in the city of Ur. And this was indeed a masterstroke of political and religious integration, by having an Akkadian princess preside over one of the chief Sumerian religious centers. Sargon wove his family into the sacred fabric of Sumer. Enheduanna herself wasn't just famous for being the daughter of Sargon, but rather she was famous in her own right. A priestess, poet, who composed exquisite hymns. And here's a bit of trivia for you. She is actually the first known author by name. Now that's a world first, isn't it? Well, her works, dedicated to gods like Inanna, were used for centuries, and they indicate how influential Sargon's lineage became in Mesopotamian religious life. Through Enheduanna's position, Sargon secured the loyalty of Ur, and perhaps gained divine sanction from the moon god for his own dynasty. Now, with all Sumer under his domain, he didn't take the chance to rest, but rather to double down. He next turned his attention to the lands beyond Mesopotamia's traditional borders. The ambition and scope of this kind of military campaign was unprecedented. According to later commemorative inscriptions, Sargon campaigned in every direction. Eastward into Elam, southwestern Iran, north into the mountains of Subartu, northern Mesopotamia and Assyria, and west to the Upper Sea. That's what they used to call the Mediterranean. One year name of Sargon's reign, year names were, by the way, how Mesopotamians identified each year by a notable event, was recorded as, quote, the year in which Sargon conquered Elam. But what's Elam? It was a region bordering Sumer to the east. It had numerous city-states and peoples with their own language and culture. Sargon's army marched across the Tigris, and dealt a crushing blow to Elamite cities like Awan and Susa. He boasts of destroying cities there and incorporating Elam into his empire's sphere, and by doing so, he secured his empire's eastern flank and gained access to resources like metals and timber from Iran. Sargon appointed Akkadian governors in the Elamite territories as well, effectively making them provinces of Akkad. Off to a good start, that's for sure. It is certainly Akkadian boy summer, that's for sure. So to the north, Sargon advanced into areas later known as Assyria and parts of Syria. Now, remember, we have to separate those two. Assyria and Syria are different. He reportedly captured the cities of Ashur and Nineveh on the upper Tigris. But these were small settlements then. They would become major cities in later centuries, of course. By subduing the north, Sargon opened the way to control trade routes heading into Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, or Turkey, for those who have not quite got the memo yet, and secured rich agricultural lands that could support his growing army and bureaucracy. Sargon's western campaigns are among the most storied. He is said to have reached as far as the cedar forest of Lebanon on the shores of the Mediterranean, and one account claims, quote, Sargon crossed the sea in the west, and in the 11th year he conquered the western land to its farthest point, establishing that he ventured, of course, into the lands of the Amorites, and perhaps touched the coast. There is actually another anecdote, too, that Sargon set up statues of himself on the shores of the sea and washed his weapons, a ritual act signifying he had no further enemy in that direction, and that his conquest had reached the end of the land. Of course, once again, claims like that might contain a little bit of hyperbole, but archaeologically, we do have evidence that Akkadian influence reached the Syrian city of Mari, which Sargon had definitely conquered. You see, Mari is explicitly mentioned in year names as having been destroyed by him. The fall of Mari, a prominent trading city in the middle of the Euphrates, indicates Akkad's dominance extended well beyond the Mesopotamian heartland. Trade networks from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean came under Akkadian oversight, and this allowed Sargon to produce goods from distant regions. Some later traditions even assert that ships from distant lands like Meluha, that is the Indus Valley, and Magan, possibly referring to Oman, docked in Sargon's ports, bringing all sorts of exotic goodies. Of course, once again, direct evidence of Sargon reaching the Indus is pretty lacking, but it does show the idea that under Sargon's empire, international trade did flourish quite widely, or at least widely in terms of the geography and circumstance. In the northwest, one text suggests Sargon campaigned as far as Anatolia, a possible reference to conquering parts of Anatolia or sending expeditions there appears in chronicles that would align with Akkadian artifacts found in Turkey. It is conceivable that Sargon sought the valuable silver mines of Anatolia, as silver, of course, was the monetary standard of the time. To manage these vast territories, Sargon innovated in military organization. He is often credited with creating one of the first standing armies. A boast from his inscription states that 5,400 soldiers ate bread daily in his presence. Of course, this suggests that he maintained a core force of thousands of professional troops at his capital, essentially a full-time royal army that could be dispatched anywhere needed. And this was a notable departure from earlier reliance on militia levies from each city during civil wars. A permanent army, well, that gave Sargon a strategic edge, enabling rapid responses to rebellions or threats and continuous campaigning year after year. And modern historians generally see this as the birth of a professional military structure, something that later empires would take on board and maintain. Sargon's forces likely included a mix of infantry, perhaps some early chariotry or mobile troops, and auxiliary units from different parts of his realm. He's also said to have combined various types of soldiers in novel ways to maximize battlefield flexibility. An example of that is he could integrate spearmen, archers, and axemen from different ethnic groups into a single fighting force. Tactics like that allowed him to face diverse enemies, from mountain tribes to fortified city militias. The cumulative effect of Sargon's campaigns was the forging of an empire that stretched roughly from the lower sea to the upper sea, at least in Mesopotamian terms. In our terms, we can say from the Persian Gulf in the southeast to the Mediterranean in the northwest. And of course, no king before him, at least that we know of, I'm sure we would have heard about it if there was, had ruled so vast a domain in this region. But conquering an empire, that's one thing. Governing it long term, entirely different skill set, arguably an even greater challenge. Sargon demonstrated a shrewd grasp of administration and statecraft to keep his dominion intact, especially since he really had no point of reference. It's not as if anybody had ever done it before. But one of the primary strategies was to install trusted officials in key cities throughout the empire. He couldn't be in all places at once, so he had to have people go and do the job for him. Delegating, that kind of thing. A later Babylonian text speaks admiringly of the citizens of Akkad, whom Sargon placed as governors in over 65 cities. Now, this indicates a centralized bureaucratic approach. Akkadian administrators, often ethnically Akkadian, or at least loyal to the Akkadian regime, were dispatched to rule conquered cities and regions on Sargon's behalf. By doing so, Sargon diminished the autonomy of local dynasties and tied the governance of each region directly to his throne. These officials likely collected taxes, enforced laws, and maintained their own garrisons. The Empire of Sargon was the first to implement what we might call a federal system, over Mesopotamia. He had an overarching rule, but delegated day-to-day control to governors and ensi who answered to him directly. Evidence suggests that Akkadian became the lingua franca of administration across the realm, gradually supplanting Sumerian for official records. This linguistic shift to Akkadian, a Semitic language, from Sumerian, a language isolate, was a significant cultural change initiated during Sargon's reign. It meant that scribes from different cities could communicate in one language, and it reinforced the unity of the empire under Akkad's cultural influence. But even so, Sumerian did not disappear. It remained the language of religion and high literature, and Sargon himself had quite a respect for Sumerian traditions. In fact, Sargon patronized the city of Nippur, the religious capital of Sumer, by restoring and venerating its temples, thus aligning himself with ancient sacred institutions to legitimize his rule. We already mentioned the canny move of him appointing his daughter Enheduanna as the high priestess of Ur, and this was part of Sargon's broader policy of intertwining his family with regional power structures. Enheduanna's tenure as priestess solidified Akkadian control over Ur's immense religious and economic clout. Now you see, temples, of course, in those days controlled huge landownings and resources. Through her famous hymns which praised gods like Inanna and acknowledged the supremacy of the Akkadian leadership, Enheduanna also helped merge Sumerian and Akkadian religious identity. It's quite telling that Enheduanna refers to herself as, quote, the daughter of Sargon in her writings, even in devotional literature. the royal family's presence was asserted. Sargon also developed practical infrastructure to manage the empire. Roads and communication. They were both improved to speed up the movement of troops and information across vast distances, and there were certainly vast distances to go across. There are two references to a system of posting stations or checkpoints. One chronicle notes that Sargon stationed his officials at intervals of a double hour along the roads, which implies some regular spacing of outposts, possibly for relays. This might be an embryonic form of the postal or messenger system, and in fact archaeologists have found that by Sargon's time, clay tablets, which I suppose we can look at as letters, were sometimes wrapped in outer clay envelopes marked with the recipient's name and a seal, a secure way to send correspondence that could only be opened by the intended party. It could be seen as the world's first postal system, at least quite in its infancy, ensuring reliable communication throughout the empire. The efficiency of such communication would have been crucial for controlling far-flung provinces, and of course reacting to events like revolts or foreign incursions. And then we have another aspect of Sargon's governance, the standardization of weights and measures. It sounds a bit boring, but it's actually extremely important. To facilitate trade and taxation across diverse regions, Sargon's administration likely imposed uniform measures so that merchants from Akkad to Mari to Susa used the same units. Later tradition credits Sargon with establishing just taxation and fair trade practice, suggesting that he reformed economic management to keep resources flowing to his capital. Akkad, the royal city, accumulated wealth from across Mesopotamia in the form of tribute and taxes, grain, cattle, precious metals, textile, and of course labor for royal projects. And here's a telling sign of Akkad's central prominence, Sargon's relationship with the city of Babylon. There are conflicting accounts in Babylonian and later chronicles. One states that Sargon, quote, built Babylon in front of Akkad. Another says that he dug up earth from Babylon and made a new Babylon next to Akkad. These are clearly anachronistic tales. Babylon was a minor town in Sargon's day, but extremely important later on. So later scribes connected Sargon to it. However, the fact that Sargon is associated with building projects in Babylon hints that he paid some attention to developing cities beyond his capital. He possibly invested in fortifying or beautifying strategic cities throughout his empire, and that includes Babylon, of course. But we do know for certain that Akkad itself was enriched with the spoils of conquest. What chronicle describes Sargon ferrying the West's booty across the Euphrates on barges back to Akkad? Well, this treasure would have included cedar wood from Lebanon, metals, and other valuables. Sargon erected statues of himself in conquered lands too, as mentioned, and likely also in Akkad to display his victories. And then we have Queen Tashlul-Tum, Sargon's wife, who we should note here as well. Though little is said of her in surviving texts, records preserve her name, indicating she was an important figure at court. The knowledge of her name and the names of several of Sargon's children shows that Sargon established a dynasty with conscious intent. He was not a one-generation wonder. He laid plans for succession. Indeed, he had at least 2 sons who succeeded him, Rimush and Manishtushu, and daughters like Enheduanna in influential roles. Sorry about my Facebook notification going off there. Well, the Akkadian Empire under Sargon was a family enterprise in many ways, with royal kin placed in critical positions across the vast realm. But for all of Sargon's brilliant accomplishments, his reign was not peaceful to the end. Empire building tends to generate a bit of resentment, to say the least, and Sargon faced numerous rebellions from those he had subjugated. They weren't very happy with the boot being placed on their neck. The pattern of his rule involved constant warfare, either expanding the frontiers or quelling uprisings within them. Now earlier on, as we saw, the Sumerian city-states revolted almost immediately after Sargon took power, forcing him to reconquer some of them to prove his legitimacy. But even after his authority was established far and wide, discontent simmered beneath the surface. Ancient records, particularly a Babylonian chronicle known as the Chronicle of Early Kings, describe how late in Sargon's life trouble struck again on a grand scale. It says that, quote, "In his old age, all the lands revolted against him and surrounded him in Akkad." Well, one can imagine the aging king, perhaps in his 50s or 60s, suddenly beset by rebellion on all sides. A massive coordinated uprising was of the cities that had been forced into his empire. The chronicle goes on to credit Sargon with rising to the challenge, though. Despite his years, quote, "the old lion still had teeth and claws." Sargon allegedly proclaimed that no opponent would equal him and marched out to battle. He fought decisively and defeated the rebellion cities, crushing their vast armies. A more colorful narrative has him, quote, "knocking them over like reeds and destroying their hosts." Well, if this account is based on genuine tradition, it shows that Sargon's tenacity and personal leadership was even there in advanced age. He reasserts control through blood and iron one last time, proving that his earlier conquests were no fluke at all. I suppose we shouldn't really say iron at this time, but you get the metaphor. However, one revolt was hardly the end of his troubles. The same chronicle suggests that shortly after suppressing a widespread revolt, Sargon faced an invasion from a foreign region, this region called Subatu. That is a term that is often used for upper Mesopotamian and Syrian areas. Subatu's forces attacked in full strength, Sargon using his tactical skills at an ambush and utterly defeated them, scattering their army and looting their camp. And this victory further solidified his legend. Even in the twilight of his reign, no enemy could defeat the great Sargon of Akkad. But despite victory after victory, these events, the mere presence of rebellions themselves, hindered underlying instability. The conquered peoples, they never really fully accepted Akkadian rule, and unity had to be forced repeatedly by arms. Sargon's own inscriptions perhaps allude to this when they emphasize how the gods Enlil and Inanna granted him no rival, a divine endorsement he likely invoked to quell doubts among the populace. The frequent revolts suggest that managing such a large realm was exceedingly difficult with the communication and administrative tools of the time. But it's a testament to Sargon's leadership that the empire held together through these crises. Ancient Mesopotamians, ever religious in their interpretation of fortune, later ascribed Sargon's late troubles to the wrath of the gods. There's one interesting little anecdote. It holds that Sargon committed an offense against Babylon's patron deity, Marduk. In the Chronicle of Early Kings, after mentioning Sargon's building of a, quote, Babylon next to Akkad, it comments again, quote, Because of the wrong he had done, the great Lord Marduk became angry and destroyed his people by famine. From east to west, the subjects rebelled against him. Now this is a later mythic explanation, historically not accurate since, well, Marduk was not yet a supreme god in Sargon's time. But it is fascinating that later Babylonians felt that even Sargon must be chastened by a god for hubris. In this case, the hubris of trying to overshadow Babylon. They imagined a famine striking Akkad as punishment, and even that Sargon suffered from insomnia inflicted by the angry deity. Yeah, maybe Marduk's angry at me lately. I've been having trouble sleeping. How to fix that problem, I don't know. But such stories show that Sargon's reign had become a canvas for moral lessons by these subsequent generations. In reality, environmental or economic stresses could indeed have played a role in sparking revolts. For instance, a famine would make the populace restive. You know what I mean. And there is some modern evidence that towards the end of the Akkadian dynasty, Mesopotamia faced drought and climate shifts that disrupted agriculture. It's conceivable that late in Sargon's reign or shortly after that the harvests failed, weakening central control and fueling rebellions. People seem to get a bit angry when they're hungry, that's for sure. But if any of that began under Sargon, it would further explain the cascade of rebellions that he had to face. Well, ultimately, after quelling these late challenges, Sargon died in old age, likely of natural causes. What? Were you expecting a heroic last stand in a battle? Not all kings go out, guns blazing. Sometimes it's just peacefully slipping away in their bed, or whatever they have that resembles a bed 4,000 years ago. The Sumerian king list affirms that he reigned for 56 years. Some copies say 55 or 54, but in any case, over half a century. This longevity hints that he must have established efficient structures and loyalists to stay in power so long despite so many conflicts. And when he died, around 2279 BCE by modern estimates, he was succeeded by his sons in turn. His immediate heir was Rimush, and after Rimush's short reign, another son, Manishtushu, took the throne. And guess what? They both faced further revolts, a sign that Sargon's passing emboldened subject cities for trying to get their independence back again. But the Akkadian Empire stayed intact through these reigns, but just barely. They were hanging on by a string. Sargon's vigorous presence was sorely missed. So how do we sum up the legacy of the first conqueror? I suppose we can take a twofold approach. The concrete historical legacy of the empire he founded, and the legendary aura that grew around his name for millennia. In strict historical terms, Sargon's creation, the Akkadian Empire, is regarded as the world's first true empire, meaning a multi-ethnic, centrally ruled domain extending over a large territory. That is, are general terms for the word. He proved that one king could rule dozens of cities and diverse peoples under a single administration. This model would be emulated by countless later figures, from Babylonian kings to Persian shahs and beyond. In Mesopotamia specifically, later dynasties like the Ur-3 kings, for example, Ur-Nammu of Ur around 2100 BCE, borrowed directly from the playbook of Sargon, even stylistically linking themselves to him. The Ur-3 kings revived a few of Sargon's strategies. They too appointed daughters as priestesses and maintained standing armies. They explicitly looked back to the golden age of Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin as an ideal to recapture. Even the city of Babylon, which rose to prominence over a few centuries after Sargon, might have been influenced by the Akkadian template. Babylon eventually became the capital of the empire under Hammurabi sometime around 1750, and that empire can be seen as a successor in concept to Sargon's, uniting Mesopotamia under Semitic rule. And indeed, Hammurabi's scribes preserve the memory of Sargon. We find that Sargon's military exploits and maxims were copied in scribal schools throughout the old Babylonian period. One Babylonian text recounts Sargon's challenge to future rulers. After describing how he defeated all his enemies, Sargon purportedly says, "Now, any king who wants to call himself my equal, wherever I went, let him go." Well, it's a bold dare, isn't it? A way to say that no later king could match Sargon's accomplishments unless they could literally reconquer the world just as he did. Now, in a cultural sense, Sargon's reign accelerated the blending of Akkadian, that being Semitic, and Sumerian worlds. The art from his period, such as steles and cylinder seals, show a fusion of styles. One famous artifact often associated with Sargon is the bronze head of an Akkadian king, discovered in Nineveh, though likely made in Akkad's time. It's an exquisitely crafted life-size head, with intricate beard and hairstyle, is thought by many to represent Sargon himself, though some do argue it could depict Naram-Sin, his grandson. But regardless, the Assyrians, who found it in the ruins of Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, treated it as a likeness of Sargon, and honored it accordingly. That piece of art has become an icon of Mesopotamian civilization. It symbolizes the majesty of the Akkadian kings. Its survival and later veneration in Assyria show how Sargon's memory endured as a symbol of power. Well, literature is another realm of his legacy. His daughter Enheduanna's writings are a direct, tangible legacy, the earliest literature by a named author, of course. Well, through Enheduanna, one could say that Sargon's lineage contributed to humanity's literary heritage, but beyond that, Sargon himself became a character in later literary works. That baby in the basket story that we mentioned, the Sargon legend, was copied by Assyrian and Babylonian scribes well over 1,000 years after he lived, showing that the populace continued to be fascinated by his origin story. And then another piece, the Chronicle of Sargon, and the epic King of the Battle, which might reference Sargon's deeds, indicate that a cycle of heroic tales surrounded him too. However, not all mentions of Sargon were glowing. Mesopotamian writers also composed works like the Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian poetic text from centuries after Sargon, which tells of how the gods became angry at Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin and destroyed the city of Akkad as punishment. In that tale, the downfall of Akkad is depicted as a divine retribution of sorts for the arrogance of the Akkadian kings. Well, this tells us that by the end of the Sargonic dynasty, which collapsed around 2190, there was a sense of hubris tied to Sargon's line, the idea that they had overstepped cosmic boundaries. Interestingly, in the Curse of Akkad, Sargon himself is portrayed in a somewhat positive light as a pious king, whom the gods once favored. It wasn't him, but rather his successor that erred. But in any case, the subtext is that the empire Sargon built did not last forever, and was ultimately brought down. And historically, indeed, after Sargon's great-grandson Shar-Kali-Shari, the Akkadian Empire did fragment, weakened by internal strife and foreign pressures. The Gutian invaders from the Zagros Mountains, often blamed by later accounts for, quote, destroying the civilization of Mesopotamia. Either way, within a century of Sargon's death, Mesopotamia entered a period of chaos and local rule, slipping back into what many have called another dark age. Yet crucially, the idea of an empire was not lost. When order was restored by new dynasties, or like the third dynasty of Ur and the later Old Babylonian Empire, they consciously modeled their kingship on Sargon's example. The kings of Ur III sometimes adopted epithets and practices reminiscent of Sargon and Naram-Sin. In Assyria, much later, kings would even take Sargon's name. For example, Sargon II of Assyria in the 8th century BCE, to invoke that legacy of power. Being linked to Sargon of Akkad, it became a badge of legitimacy and ambition. So let's think about all of that. The life story of Sargon of Akkad. It is an archetype of a rise from obscurity to global dominance, a rags to riches kind of tale. In the strictest of historical terms, he transformed Mesopotamia by demonstrating how a centralized empire could be run. He pioneered military and administrative techniques that would reappear throughout ancient history, and the short-term impact of his conquest was the spread of Akkadian language and culture, a brand new political order in the East, too. And the long-term impact, nothing short of inspirational. He became a legend, a cultural memory of what a great king could achieve. The ancient storytellers cast him as that fearless conqueror, the clever commoner who became king, and even as the, quote, old lion who refused to be defeated by the younger generation. Well, from a modern perspective, he stands at the dawn of recorded political history as the first known emperor. His biography, insofar as we can piece it together, reads like a prototype of later legendary leaders. Mysterious birth, divine favor, dramatic reversals of fortune, a ruthless conquest, administrative genius, and eventually struggles. Lots and lots of struggles. I think we can all appreciate that there's a blend of fact and fable that envelops the character, and we can be reasonably certain that Sargon was indeed a historical figure who did pretty much most of what the ancient sources said that he did, unifying Mesopotamia by force and governing effectively. But we also acknowledge that the legend is polished by storytellers to inspire subsequent generations. But I don't think that's so bad, because when I look at it, I certainly am inspired. And I hope you are too, because that's the end of the video. Perhaps it's your turn to go out and conquer the world as we wait for another Sargon of Akkad. Who knows? Well, let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford, Near, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nevatari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer and Brittany. All right. I do apologize for the dramatics. Just whenever I see Free American's name, I always think of Hulk Hogan. Yeah, I'm sure you know who Hulk Hogan is. Comment for Hulk Hogan. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a great video, I think. I will see you whenever you feel inclined to return. You know where I'll be. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.